Part the ancestral weight of the Wind River. There is a specific haunting kind of silence that exists only in the high desert of the American West, a silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, ancient presence that seems to watch you from the jagged shadows of the granite peaks. In the Wind River range of Wyoming, this silence feels older than the mountains themselves, a lingering remnant of a time when the earth was still cooling, and the stars were the only witnesses to the slow, grinding movement of the prehistoric glaciers. For Elias Thorne, a man whose very soul was woven into the gray-green sagebrush and the harsh, unforgiving skylines of the frontier, this silence had been his only true companion for 72 years. He was a man of the old world, a relic of a time before the neon hum of the modern age began to drown out the whispers of the wilderness. He lived in the deep throat of a valley so wide and hollow it felt like the bottom of a dried-up, ancient ocean. Here the horizon was not a line, but a jagged crown of stone, and the sky was a vast, terrifying dome of indigo that made a man feel both infinitely small and strangely chosen. Elias was a man carved from the very elements he tended. His skin was a living cartography of the Wyoming landscape, deeply etched with lines that told stories of 40 below winters, blistering summer droughts, and the relentless, scouring wind that never truly stopped blowing across the high plateaus. He lived in a cabin built by his grandfather's own hands, a structure of heavy pine logs and fieldstone that had stood for a century, growing more silver and resilient with every passing decade. Each timber in that house had a voice. They groaned under the weight of the snow and whispered during the heat of the day, a constant, low-frequency dialogue between the shelter and the land. Elias understood these sounds. He knew the difference between the house settling for the night and the approach of a predator. He knew when the earth was content and when it was preparing to lash out. To Elias, the ranch was not just property. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded respect and granted a harsh, lonely kind of peace. His life was a masterpiece of analog simplicity, a deliberate rejection of the encroaching chaos of the 20th century. It was measured not by digital displays, glowing screens, or the frantic, meaningless pace of the outside world, but by the rhythmic clinking of the cast iron stove every morning, the smell of wood smoke clinging to his heavy wool coat, and the steady, mechanical vibration of his 1950 Ford F1 truck. That truck was more than a vehicle. It was a companion, a rolling testament to endurance held together by baling wire, layers of grease, and Elias' own stubborn refusal to let the past die. When the engine turned over, the roar of the V8 felt like a heartbeat, a mechanical reassurance that some things were still built to last. His only other constant was Buddy, a black Labrador whose muzzle had turned the color of a winter cloud, reflecting the slow, steady passage of time they had both endured in the absolute solitude of the range. They shared a bond forged in the profound, wordless spaces of the plains, a partnership of whistles and hand signals that required no spoken words to convey the deepest of truths. Together, they moved through the seasons like ghosts, observers of a world that was slowly being replaced by something louder and less sacred. The autumn of 1981 arrived not with a gentle cooling, but with a sudden, violent shiver that seemed to descend from the peaks like a silent, white predator. The air, which usually carried the warm, dusty scent of a lingering summer in early October, had turned sharp and brittle overnight. The frost didn't just coat the ground. It seemed to bite into the very grain of the wood, a cold that felt alien, calculated, and predatory. On that particular Tuesday, as the sun began its slow, agonizing descent behind the western ridges, Elias sat on his weathered porch. He watched the light bleed from a pale gold into a deep, electric violet, a color so vibrant it felt unnatural, a hue that seemed to vibrate against the backdrop of the darkening granite. He watched as the stars began to pierce the veil of the atmosphere, appearing larger and closer than they had any right to be. Usually, this was the hour when the world began to breathe. The crickets would start their rhythmic thrumming, the wind would whisper through the dry bunchgrass like a restless spirit, and the distant, lonely chorus of the coyotes would echo across the canyon walls, marking their territory in the dark. But tonight there was nothing, no movement, no sound, no breath of wind. The air felt heavy and compressed, as if a massive, invisible hand had been placed over the valley, drawing all the energy and sound out of the atmosphere. Elias felt a sudden, sharp prickle of intuition on the back of his neck, a primal alarm encoded in the marrow of his ancestors, warning him that the threshold between the known and the unknown had become dangerously thin. It was a silence that didn't just exist, it listened. It felt as though the valley itself was holding its breath, waiting for a cue from a conductor that no human could see. Buddy, who had been dozing near the porch steps, stood up with a sudden, jarring rigidity. His ears were cocked toward the western valley, and a low, guttural rumble, a sound of deep, ancestral recognition, vibrated in his chest. It wasn't the bark he gave for a part I, the anatomy of the void. By the time the moon rose, a pale and sickly orb that seemed to cast more shadow than light, the silence in the valley had become deafening. Elias stayed on the porch for hours, his thumb resting on the safety of the rifle, his senses heightened to an almost painful degree. He watched a faint, blue luminescence begin to gather at the base of the mountains, a mist that didn't drift with the wind but flowed like liquid against the gravity of the slopes. It was a cold light, a light that didn't illuminate but seemed to erase the details of the world it touched, turning the familiar sagebrush into unrecognizable, ghostly shapes. He didn't go inside until the first hint of gray touched the eastern horizon, but sleep did not come. He knew, even as he closed the heavy timber door and bolted it shut, that he was no longer alone on his ranch. The observation had begun, and he was the subject. The following morning, the sun rose over a world that appeared identical to the one Elias had known for 70 years, yet he knew with a terrifying certainty that the core of it had shifted. The light was too white, casting shadows that felt too solid, as if the very geometry of the world had been recalibrated during the night. The behavior of his livestock was the final confirmation. His herd of Hereford cattle, usually scattered across the northern pasture in a loose, content arrangement, were huddled together in a tight, shivering mass near the fence line. They weren't grazing, they weren't even moving. They were staring with wide, unblinking eyes toward the narrow, shadow-choked canyon known to the locals as the Devil's Throat. Their collective fear was a physical weight in the air, a silent scream that Elias could feel in his own chest. When Elias performed his morning count, his voice was a mere whisper against the vastness of the plains, a sound that felt brittle and hollow. Old Red, his prize bull and a 3,000-pound anchor of the ranch's lineage, was gone. There were no broken fences, no signs of a struggle in the dust, and most importantly, no tracks of predators, no wolf prints, no bear claws, nothing. It was as if the massive beast had been plucked from the earth by a silent, celestial hook, leaving behind only the cold, unyielding dust. Elias saddled his bay horse, a sturdy animal named Cinder that had never once flinched at the scent of a grizzly or the crack of a midsummer thunderstorm. But as they neared the mouth of the canyon, the horse stopped. It planted its hooves in the copper-colored dirt and began to shake with such violence that Elias could feel the tremors through the leather of the saddle. The horse emitted a high, thin whinny of pure, unadulterated terror, a sound that echoed off the granite walls like the scream of a ghost. No amount of coaxing, spurring, or gentle words would move the animal an inch further into the dark, absolute shadow of the peaks. Elias dismounted, the horse's fear heightening his own. The silence of the canyon pressed against his ears like deep, pressurized water, making his head throb with every step. He walked into the throat, Buddy trailing behind him with his tail tucked so tightly it touched his belly, the dog's paws making no sound on the hard-packed earth. The air inside the canyon was colder than the mountain peak, a dry, sterile chill that smelled of ozone and ancient, frozen dust, a scent that reminded Elias of the static electricity from an old television set, but amplified 1,000 times. Just inside the first bend of the granite walls, Elias found the first anomaly. A perfect, scorched circle, exactly 30 feet in diameter, had been pressed into the earth. The sagebrush within the circle wasn't burned by fire. It had been rendered into a fine gray powder, as if the very molecular structure of the plants had been pulverized by a localized high-frequency vibration. The ground within the circle was cold, unnaturally, impossibly cold, radiating a chill that seemed to bypass his skin and strike directly at the marrow of his bones. 50 yards further into the deepening shadows, he found Old Red. The bull was lying on a flat, natural granite slab, positioned with a surgical, terrifying deliberation. There was no blood on the stone, no sign of a struggle, and no scent of decay in the air, despite the animal having been dead for hours. A large, circular section of the animal's hide had been removed from the left flank with a precision that made Elias' stomach turn. The edges of the wound were cauterized and smooth as glass, white as bleached bone. The internal organs were visible through the opening, but they appeared to have been drained of all color, looking like wax models in a forgotten museum. Most hauntingly, the animal's eyes were wide open, staring directly upward with a look of frozen, crystalline shock, the pupils dilated to the very edges of the iris. Elias looked up, following the bull's dead, unblinking gaze. High above the canyon rim, suspended against the deep, cloudless blue of the Wyoming sky, was a shape. It wasn't a craft in the way. Part I, the resonance of the monolith. He returned to the cabin in a daze, the image of the black slit burned into his retinas like a permanent scar. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light, a mirage caused by the thin mountain air and the exhaustion of a sleepless night, but the heavy weight in his chest told him otherwise. The third night brought the monolith, and with it, the end of the world as Elias knew it. He was sitting in his kitchen, the low, flickering light of the kerosene lamp casting long, distorted shadows against the pine log walls. He was trying to write in his ranch ledger, trying to ground himself in the familiar reality of hay costs and cattle counts, but the pen wouldn't stay still in his hand. The silence outside had transformed into a physical pressure, a mounting tension that felt like a spring being wound too tight, until the very air in the cabin felt thin and oxygen-starved. Suddenly, the steady, rhythmic hum of his gasoline generator outside ceased. It didn't sputter out or run out of fuel. The sound was simply deleted from the air. The lights in the cabin didn't flicker. They vanished, leaving him in a darkness so absolute it felt like he had been buried alive in the cold Wyoming soil. He stepped onto the porch, his boots creaking on the wood, the air smelling of ozone and ancient, frozen dust. Standing in the middle of his yard, right where the dust of the driveway met the gray-green sagebrush, was a pillar of shadow. It was a 4-meter-tall rectangular block, a monolith of such profound blackness that it seemed to draw the light of the stars into itself, creating a halo of darkness around its edges. It possessed no texture, no seams, and no reflection. It was a solid piece of the void, standing in the Wyoming dirt as if it had been there for 1 billion years, waiting for this exact moment. As Elias approached, a low-frequency resonance began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears. It was a frequency he felt in his teeth, in his ribs, and in the very center of his skull. The monolith was vibrating at a speed that made its edges appear blurred, as if it were oscillating between this dimension and another. Buddy was frozen at the edge of the porch, his eyes wide and fixed on the object, his body trembling so violently that the wood beneath him rattled. The dog was staring at the monolith not with fear, but with a kind of paralyzed, ancient recognition. Elias reached out his hand, his fingers trembling. The moment his calloused, sun-worn skin touched the surface of the monolith, the world vanished. He wasn't standing in Wyoming anymore. He was standing in the center of an infinite, roaring ocean of light and time. He saw the Wind River Mountains as they were 100 million years ago, towering peaks of jagged, molten fire rising from a primeval, steaming sea. He saw them as they would be 100 million years from now, worn down to flat, gray pebbles by an unceasing galactic wind. He saw his own life, not as a sequence of events, but as a single static map, his birth, his mother's face, the day he married, and the quiet, lonely moment of his own death, all happening at once, layered like the strata of the canyon walls. He saw the American paradox, a land of modern machines and scientific certainty built on top of a foundation of ancient, cosmic anomalies that the human mind was never meant to comprehend. The monolith showed him the observers, beings composed of pure light and geometric shadow who had sat on these ridges before the first man had ever walked the plains, and who would be there long after the sun had expanded and turned into a cold, black ember. He realized then that time was not a river flowing in one direction. It was a vast, dark ocean, and he was merely a single drop of water caught in its currents. The observation was not a choice, it was a fundamental law of the universe. The resonance grew louder, the light brighter, until the very concept of Elias Thorne began to dissolve into the white noise of the cosmos. He was no longer a rancher, no longer a man. He was a data point in a celestial ledger, a moment of consciousness being observed by the void. And then, with a violent, jarring snap of pressure that felt like being thrown against a stone wall, the ocean of light was gone. Elias Thorne awoke on his porch. He was slumped in his wooden chair, the same chair his father had built from Wyoming cedar. A light dusting of snow covered his heavy wool coat, and the air was the gray, bone-chilling color of a winter dawn. He felt as though he had only closed his eyes for a second, a brief lapse in a long, weary night. He reached for his rifle, but his hands were trembling with a weakness he didn't recognize. His joints ached with a deep, arthritic cold that felt as though it had been there for decades. He looked at Buddy. The dog was lying in his usual spot, but he didn't get up. He didn't wag his tail. Elias crawled over to him, his heart sinking. Buddy's black fur had turned entirely snow white. The dog's eyes were cloudy with cataracts, and his breathing was a thin, ragged whistle. Buddy had aged 20 years in what Elias thought was a single night. Elias walked into the kitchen and looked at the calendar. It was November. 21 days had vanished from the world. The logs in the stove were cold ash. The milk in the larder was a solid, moldy brick. The water in the pipes had frozen and burst, leaving jagged icicles hanging from the sink. He had no memory of those 3 weeks, yet his mind was a blank slate, save for one lingering, crystalline image. The black void in the sky and the feeling of 1,000 eyes watching him from the folds of time. He spent the rest of his years sitting on that porch, staring at the Wind River peaks with a look of peaceful, terrifying clarity. He never spoke of the monolith to the people in town, and he never ran his generator again, for the cabin was always filled with a soft, blue light that had no source. Buddy passed away. The Vault of Echo, Part I, the Architecture of Secrecy. The weight of the earth is not a metaphor. It is a physical, unrelenting pressure that sits upon the soul of anyone who dares to venture deep beneath the crust of the Montana tundra. When you're suspended 300 feet below the frozen surface of the Great Falls, the silence of the world above is replaced by a sound that is far more terrifying. The sound of the planet itself breathing, a low-frequency groan of shifting tectonic plates and ancient, compressed stone. For Arthur Vance, a man whose entire life was built upon the rigid laws of structural engineering and the predictable behavior of reinforced concrete, that silence had always been a professional comfort. He understood the stress points of a missile silo. He knew the exact tensile strength of the steel doors that guarded the nuclear heart of the nation. He was a structural safety inspector for the Department of Defense, a man of cold facts and blueprinted certainties, until the winter of 1985, when he was asked to descend into a hole that had no bottom and a history that began before the first man had ever looked at the stars. Arthur was a man who found peace in the geometry of the known world. His hands were perpetually stained with the faint scent of diesel and graphite, and his eyes were trained to see the microscopic fractures in a weld or the subtle shifting of a foundation that could spell disaster for a multi-million-dollar installation. He had spent 20 years in the service of a government that demanded absolute precision and absolute silence. He was a shadow in the bureaucracy, a man who ensured the machines of war were housed in structures that could withstand the end of the world. He believed in the solidity of the earth and the reliability of American steel. He lived in a world where every problem had a technical solution and every anomaly could be measured, categorized, and corrected. But the Great Falls of Montana in 1985 was preparing to show him that some structures are not built by hands, and some foundations are laid upon the shifting sands of a paradox. The winter of 1985 had descended upon the plains like a white shroud, a season of unrelenting blizzards that turned the landscape into a featureless void of wind and ice. Arthur had been stationed near Malmstrom Air Force Base for 3 months, performing routine audits on the aging Minuteman silos scattered across the frozen prairie. It was tedious, mechanical work, the kind of labor that numbs the mind and freezes the marrow. However, on a Friday evening, as the sun was being extinguished by a jagged horizon of gray clouds, Arthur received a call that bypassed the standard chain of command. The voice on the other end was a monotone drone, devoid of the static that usually accompanied field transmissions. There were no pleasantries, only a set of coordinates and a command that carried the weight of a presidential decree. He was to report to Site 7 Echo, a location that did not exist on any map in his possession, nor in the extensive databases he had memorized over 2 decades. The drive was an exercise in sensory deprivation. Arthur pushed his heavy-duty government truck through a landscape of white on white, the headlights cutting. Part II, the descent into the obsidian. The elevator did not belong to the world of 1985. It was a platform of brushed, seamless metal, devoid of buttons, a floor indicator, or a manufacturer's plate. It possessed only a single glowing blue sensor that pulsed with the rhythm of a slow, biological heartbeat. When Arthur placed his hand near it, the descent didn't feel like mechanical movement. It felt like the world was being pulled away from beneath his boots. The elevator didn't hum or vibrate. It moved in an absolute, terrifying silence that lasted for what felt like an eternity. He watched the digital depth gauge on his wrist, 200 feet, 300, 500. The numbers began to blur as the elevator plunged deeper into the bedrock of the planet than any silo Arthur had ever inspected. He felt the atmospheric pressure change, the air growing dense and ancient, smelling of ozone and minerals that had never seen the light of the sun. When the doors finally parted, Arthur wasn't in a military bunker anymore. He was standing at the threshold of a vaulted chamber that defied every law of structural engineering he had ever mastered. The walls were not made of concrete or steel. They were composed of a translucent, obsidian-like substance that seemed to absorb the light from his industrial flashlight rather than reflecting it. The ceiling was lost in a height that shouldn't have been possible at that depth, draped in a soft blue luminescence that had no visible source, casting long, liquid shadows that seemed to move independently of his own movements. The floor was a single, seamless sheet of the same dark material, and as Arthur walked, his footsteps made no sound, no click of leather on stone, no echo. It was as if the room itself was designed to eat sound, to preserve a silence that had lasted for millions of years. As he moved deeper into the vault, Arthur's technical mind began to fracture. He looked for the stress points, the expansion joints, the support columns, but there were none. The chamber appeared to have been carved out of the solid granite by a force that ignored the natural grain of the stone, leaving behind a surface that was as smooth as a mirror and as cold as deep space. This was not the work of the Corps of Engineers. This was something the military had found, an archaeological anomaly that they had built a fortress around. The Site 7 Echo was not a base. It was a cage, a subterranean laboratory where the greatest minds of the Cold War were attempting to harness a power they could not hope to control. The air grew thicker, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that Arthur felt in his marrow, a rhythmic thrum that matched the pace of a slow, biological lung breathing deep within the earth. In the center of this immense hall, he saw the primary containment units. They were not silos for missiles. They were cylinders of glass-like material, 30 feet tall and filled with a thick, swirling amber gas. The gas moved with a calculated, hypnotic rhythm, swirling in patterns that looked like the rotation of distant galaxies. Arthur approached the third cylinder, his professional curiosity struggling against a rising, primal dread that told him to turn back, to run until he reached the surface and never looked down again. He raised his flashlight and the beam cut through the amber mist to reveal the occupant. It was not a machine, and it was certainly not human. It was an observer, a being of such terrifying, fragile elegance that Arthur felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep. The being was nearly 10 feet tall, its body a masterpiece of skeletal grace. Its skin was the color of liquid mercury, shimmering with a faint, internal light that moved beneath the surface like a slow-burning fire. Its limbs were long and spindly, ending in fingers that looked like delicate needles of bone. But it was the head that paralyzed Arthur, a smooth, featureless oval save for two massive, iridescent eyes that occupied nearly half of its face. Those eyes were not soft, the crack in the lens. Arthur Vance stood before the glass, his structural inspector's mind trying to find a weld, a bolt, or a seam to focus on, but his reality was crumbling. The holographic map projected by the observer was more than a display. It was a living, breathing tapestry of data. He saw the blinking lights of the Minuteman silos he had just inspected, but they looked different here. They looked like primitive, flickering candles compared to the vast, dark ocean of the vault. He realized the American paradox was not just a theme for his series, it was the reality he was living. A country built on the principles of reason and progress was secretly fueled by the observations of a creature that existed outside of time itself. The military wasn't just guarding the silos, they were guarding the observers who were calculating the exact second the world would end. As Arthur stood paralyzed, the low-frequency hum of the vault intensified, transforming into a sound that didn't come from his ears but erupted directly into his consciousness. It was a cascade of mathematical equations, sensory memories, and fragmented visions that felt like a flood of freezing water. He saw the Montana plains as they were before the mountains had even risen, a vast and shallow sea filled with bioluminescent life that looked remarkably like the being in the cylinder. He saw the construction of the vault not by machines, but by the very stone being commanded to move. And he saw the future, a world where the vault was empty, the cylinders were shattered, and the earth was nothing but a silent, gray pebble floating in a cold and indifferent void. The observer wasn't just watching the present, it was witnessing the inevitable decay of everything Arthur held dear. Suddenly, the iridescent eyes of the being shifted. For the first time in an eternity, it stopped watching the map. It looked at Arthur. In that gaze, Arthur felt the absolute insignificance of his own existence. He saw his blueprints, his safety reports, his 20-year career, and his family as nothing more than a momentary flicker of a candle in a dark, infinite room. The being reached out a long, thin finger and pressed it against the inner surface of the glass. A sound like 1,000 crystal bells shattering at once filled the chamber. The amber gas began to hiss from a microscopic fracture in the seal, a seal that Arthur was supposed to inspect, a seal that was never meant to hold a being of such power. The fracture spread like a spider web, glowing with a fierce sapphire light that threatened to consume the vault. Panic, sharp and cold as the Montana wind, finally broke through Arthur's paralysis. He turned and ran toward the elevator, his boots finally making a sound, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that echoed through the obsidian hall like a dying heart. Behind him, a choir of voices began to rise, not the screams of the dying, but a low, mournful chant in a language of pure mathematics and grief. The blue light of the vault began to pulse a violent, rhythmic red, and the air grew thick with the sweet, ozone-heavy scent of the escaping gas. He reached the elevator just as the amber mist began to spill across the floor like a creeping tide, dissolving the very shadows it touched. He hammered his hand against the blue sensor, and the ascent began, a violent, jarring journey that felt like being torn through the earth by a vengeful god. When the doors finally opened on the surface, Arthur stumbled out into the blinding white light of the blizzard. He didn't look back at the bunker. He ran to his truck, the engine screaming as he tore through the snow, leaving the non-existent Site 7 echo behind. Arthur Vance was found 2 days later, wandering the highway 20 miles away. His hair had turned a shock of snowy white, and his eyes were permanently dilated, reflecting a light that didn't exist in the sky. He never returned to his job, and he never spoke another word. He was medically retired and placed in a quiet facility in Great Falls, where he spends his days drawing endless, complex spirals on the window glass with his